Hello everyone on YouTube, my name is Lance Belderol and I will be presenting the November 22nd, 1963 You Did Not Hear About. So there was the story that you heard about the JFK assassin. So now let's hear the rest of the story. The main mistakes that researchers make about this subject is that first, they assume that multiple people were in on the planning of the murder, and second, that they don't account for the times that we lived in during the early 1960s. So look at what you're about to see with an open mind. Lee Harvey Oswald didn't do it, Jack Ruby didn't do it, and they say Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin, but he was not. In fact, you were told that there was a lone shooter and that he carefully planned everything until 12:35. It's very peculiar that he does everything wrong after that time and gets caught after committing two murders in less than 45 minutes. So many people think that there were two patsies in this whole situation, as you can see here, but today I will make a case that there were actually 7 patsies. So we must look into, first, what is a patsy? A patsy is a scapegoat, a red herring, a person accused of something as a cover for a bigger, more elaborate crime. So now, the 7 patsies are these 7 things: the people and the organizations. The first one being Lee Harvey Oswald, obviously, and the second one being Jesse Curry of the Dallas Police Department. And now the third one, we go into the FBI, the fourth one being the Warren Commission, the fifth one being Jack Ruby, and finally the sixth one and the seventh one being LBJ and the Mafia. To load a second. So patsies are needed for the public in order to cast blame on someone else. They are needed to misdirect the public's wrath and hate on someone who was not part of it and someone who can easily be hated. These are truly tragic characters. Now I will go into what a soft coup is called. A soft coup is an attempt by the US military and other organizations within the US government to change the present POTUS without any appearance of tanks, military personnel in the streets of America, or imposition of dictatorial powers that would inform the American public that in fact there had been a change of the democratic nature of the republic. So please remember, my dear readers, that a republic simply means a nation state with representation by elected intermediaries like legislators and etc. So you must recall that a republic sui generis is not by nature a democracy. So why is this concept of the maintaining of the integrity of the republic so important? Every military, intelligence, and other government leader pledges allegiance to the Constitution and the republic, not democracy. So the notion of democracy is simply implied in the Constitution and inferred by the electorates. So what happens when an elected president is no longer convenient for whatever reason? Take the case of JFK, dissipate, indecisive, pot-smoking, LSD-tripping president who threatened the perceived military strategy of strategic force. So the CIA, the military, and other organizations conveniently assassinated him. Many people quickly understood it was their duty to go along with the coup to avoid a nuclear war. So the soft coup on November 22nd of 1963, Dallas, Texas, took place because of these 15 reasons. The first one being the Bay of Pigs, the second one being the Cuba policy, the third one being that they wanted to ramp up the Vietnam War, and the fourth one being the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the fifth one being the Kennedy re-election in 1964. These 15 reasons were why they wanted to take the plan and to assassinate Kennedy in the first place. They wanted all these things to happen, and so they were being controlled in the first place, being the 7 patsies themselves. So the coup leaders used the hook. The JFK read the book and believed that this could happen in the US. He approved the movie, and what he did not know was that it was going to happen to him. The story is set in the early 1970s, 10 years in the future at the time of the film's 1964 release. And the Cold War is still a problem. US President Jordan Liman has recently signed a nuclear disarmament treaty with the Soviet Union, and the subsequent ratification by the US Senate has produced a wave of dissatisfaction, especially among Liman's opposition and the military, who believe the Soviets cannot be trusted. They were worried about a Russian nuclear attack on the US. They thought only about using our own military and our missiles. However, JFK on June 10th, 1963 said this: "No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. For those, in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." Very powerful words coming from JFK himself. But now let's look at the mutually assured destruction. So the reason why the Cold War remained cold was this: MAD. Any direct conflict risked the use of nuclear weapons. And if used, both countries would have been completely obliterated, because they would have to have shot each other when one person shot first, but then the second person would have shot second. So ultimately ending in both of the countries' destruction and ultimately the world's destruction. Thus, they engaged in shadow wars, spying, and indirect conflict. The planners used this argument plenty of times, as you can see here. And also, if we go further into it, at the end of the Kennedy administration, both the US and the USSR admitted their vulnerability because of nuclear equality. So MAD, in which one country couldn't attack because the other would be attacked in return, so essentially being whoever shoots first dies second. So they didn't want to start the war with the USSR in the first place. Nobody wanted to start a war. They play ball with us, or else the choice is yours. And this is obviously what would happen if they made that other choice. So now let's go into the 7 patsies. As you can see here, we have the FBI, the Warren Commission, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jesse Curry, LBJ Ruby, and the Mafia. So if there had been a real investigation in this whole issue, we would have these 3 things. We would have known who killed JFK. We would have known where the shots had come from, and we would not have had a change in government in the first place. Because a real investigation would have omitted all the errors that happened in the fake investigation in the first place. So many Oswald sightings point to only one thing. This is where things start to go peculiar, your readers. So multiple level of patsies at the investigation stage of the cover-up. Let's look into that. So many people have linked these people, but to JFK's death, this is the first time we can show that instead of being the architects of this assassination, they were actually the patsies themselves. The whole Warren Commission, the FBI, everyone was a patsy. So let's look into the first one. Oswald was set up to be a patsy from the very beginning, although he didn't know what he was going into in the first place. So the police failed to follow up on many significant leads, choosing to ignore them and instead just arrest him afterwards. But why? Why did they do this? Why not have a real investigation in the first place? Or why rush things over? They could have aggressively investigated this whole matter, and they could have solved everything within that time span. But why is Jack Ruby almost everywhere in Dallas? You start looking at these peculiar things, and then you start piecing together the puzzle. You realize that this is a conspiracy elaborated by someone higher than the groups established already. You can see these multiple pictures, and you can even see the Rambler of which the other Oswald was picked up in. So they could have charged everyone involved in this conspiracy, in which it would have been a conspiracy to threaten the life of the president, a conspiracy to murder the president, and under these cases, even back in 1963, if they wanted to do so, most of the people could have been prosecuted under this, United States v. Stickrath, in which it was a case where it says, in this country, sovereignty resides in the people, not in the president, who is merely their chosen representative. To threaten to kill him or to inflict upon him bodily harm stimulates opposition to national policies, however wise, even in the most critical times, incites the hostile and evil-minded to take the president's life. So then we go into this other case where they could have also prosecuted under United States v. Stobo, in which it says, whatever prior to the passage of the act may have been essential to the nature of a criminally punishable threat or its technical significance or description, in which that act recognizes as punishable as oral as well as a written threat. So they question into the fact of what their intention was for this whole thing, what their intention was for the conspiracy and for the threat in the first place. Also remember that before 1965, that there was no federal crime concerning the assassination of a president. So it was subject to a murder charge in the state where it occurred. An assassin would be tried in a state court and subject to whatever penalties that state prescribes for murder. So if you could control the investigation in Dallas, Texas, you would have not have gone to court, you could get by with murder, and you would not get caught at all. So the police investigation completely overlooked many things in this matter. So we look at all these things, right? We look at the Lansdale shooting gallery. They instead ignore all these weapons. They ignore all these things and instead try to cover it up with just the Mann-Kleiner Carcano rifle and the TSPD, in which they even find those 3 empty shells that somehow matched to the rifle. But we all think we know what happened because of these things, but do we? Do we really know what happened on that day? So a phone call to a British newspaper at 12:05 p.m., in which this is a very peculiar thing happening here again. readers. So a mystery phone call was made to the Cambridge News as gunman Oswald lay in wait for JFK's motorcade. According to the secret files of the assassination that were finally released yesterday on the orders of President Donald Trump, the man on the line hung up after telling the paper's senior reporter called the American Embassy in London for some big news. What could the big news be, and why would it have to be the American Embassy in the first place? Very weird things are going on with the whole conspiracy. Now, the call, which is believed to have been from Trader Osborne, was made at 6:05 p.m. on the fateful day, November 22nd, 1963, and less than a half hour later, JFK was dead at the age of 46. So in Dallas, Texas, these are the two sites that changed the world the early morning of November 22nd, 1963. These two sites right here. We will be showing videos later for time convenience. And now we look back into how Oswald was set up as the first patsy. So the patsy was already in position in Dealey Plaza 30 days before on October 8, 1963. So we have this article here. But how could he have known a month later that JFK's motorcade would be coming by his workplace, since the Secret Service didn't finalize and publicize the motorcade route until November 18th, 1963? Unless this happened. Note that draft cards in 1963 did not have picture ID on them, but this one did. So now we start piecing together the very weird things that are going on with this conspiracy in the first place. So he was set up with multiple doubles. In the summer of 1963 in New Orleans and here at Jack Ruby's club at the same time. Two very different people, but they were doubles of each other. And now you can also see this being a true fact in the instance that they have multiple mothers. So it was no different on November 22nd in the fact that there were multiple sightings of the same Lee Harvey Oswald. So on November 22nd, 1963 at 2:15 a.m., Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby are meeting together at the Lucas B&B Cafe on 3520 Oaklawn Avenue in Dallas, Texas. Now, why would they be meeting each other in the first place, and so early in the morning? And this was actually witnessed by a waitress who testified to this effect, as you can see right here, and where she says that she saw them in the B&B in the first place. Now, the FBI report on Mary Lawrence, it said that she saw them after the assassination. So that's weird, right? They saw it after the assassination, but it's obvious that they saw it before, very early in the morning. So events early in the morning, we see right here, a man walks into the Lucas B&B at 1:30 a.m. and sits down at the table. About an hour goes by, and then Jack Ruby comes into the B&B and looks at the young man, then takes the table behind the cash register. Jack says he did not feel good, so just orders a large glass of orange juice. A few minutes later, the young man sits down with Ruby, and afterwards, Ruby pays the tab for himself and the young man, who actually has eaten a meal. So what does this mean? This means that Mary recognized him later, and Mary Lawrence, the Lucas B&B waitress, thought that after Oswald was arrested, she recognized this man as the same individual who had dined with Ruby earlier that morning. So we have a different narrative from the ones of the Warren Commission that has set up. So the night shift cashier has agreed with her identification. Mary told the FBI that he appeared very similar to Lee Harvey Oswald, and she described him as a man in his 20s, 5'7" to 9 inches, a medium build of 140 pounds with dark hair. This is a close description of the real Oswald. So Mary tells her story to the police and the FBI. Mary's account to Dallas police approximated the one she gave to the FBI, in which she also reiterated her point that the man had a small scar near his mouth, either on the right or left side. And then they proceeded to say that Oswald had no such scar, but Mary positively identified Lee as the man who had met with Ruby at the eatery. She then seemed to back off somewhat. Some doubt was expressed, possibly after being pressured by her interrogators. Now Mary does what she thinks was the right thing to do. She went to the police to tell them that she saw Lee Harvey Oswald with Jack Ruby, and telling the police was the right thing to do, except that her story did not fit into the narrative that was being sold at the time. Lee Harvey was a lone assassin, and he did not have any help at all. So the police fight back. On December 3rd, 1963, 2 days before her FBI interview, Mary got a call from an unknown male. It was a threatening call, in which he said, if you don't want to die, you better get out of town. Why would anyone be threatening that person in the first place? So now Marina Oswald testifies that Lee Harvey Oswald was with her at the time in the Irving, Texas, at the home of Ruth and Michael Payne. Now later I will show you what Mary saw and why she was such an important witness to this conspiracy. The Warren report reveals these things. Leaving Myers at the cabana after a brief visit, Ruby returned to close the Carousel Club and obtained the night's receipts. He then went to the Vegas club, which he helped Larry Crawford close for the night. And as late as 2:30 a.m., Ruby was seen eating at a restaurant near the Vegas club. So at 2:30 a.m., he joined Larry Crawford at the Lucas B&B restaurant next door to the Vegas club, in which Crawford had managed and closed that night. So between 3:30 and 4 in the morning, Ruby dropped off Crawford at the Carousel Club and returned to his apartment, where George Senator was already asleep. So during the late night of November 21 and early morning of 22nd, Jack Ruby met with Lee Harvey Oswald. Lawrence Myers, one of his sons, Ralph, had been in Army intelligence in the late 1950s after being trained at the Russian at the Military Language School. Upon leaving the military in the early 1960s, Ralph Myers drove a bus in Chicago for a year and then moved to Mexico City spring of 1963, planning to work there as a reporter. And then we have more people in this thing. John Ates, 27-year-old girlfriend of Lawrence, registered with him as Mr. and Mrs. Myers. Edward Myers, brother and bottler from New York City, in for the Pepsi convention, and Sam Campisi, owner of the Campisi Egyptian restaurant, in which you have Bob Ties. So essentially what we have here is we're starting to see the pieces of the seven Patsy form together, where people have these very weird connections to the whole case. So here's some interesting facts on that matter. Lawrence Myers was a Chicago sporting goods wholesaler, so he would obviously have connections to weapons. Edward Myers, he was Pepsi bottling in New York City, so he has connections with the Teamsters. Sam Campisi, he has connection with the mob in New Orleans. Jack Ruby definitely has a connection with the mob in Chicago and New Orleans. Lawrence Myers' son has a connection with Army intelligence, which is the CIA. And finally, Oswald. Oswald was the double of Oswald and CIA. So the Mary Lawrence story, even though it was denied by the owner of Lucas B&B and denied by Marina Oswald as not being true, it was not believed by the police. Her story was attested to the police by the person working that shift as cashier. So how could the two stories be true? How could Oswald be in two places at once? To see, let us look at the tale of two timelines. So I will be now introducing the official version of Lee Harvey Oswald, November 22nd, 1963, in which the black letters are the official Oswald and the red letters are the other Oswald. So let's go into the timeline. At 6:30 a.m., Lee Harvey Oswald rises. At 7:15 a.m., Lenny Mae Randall sees Lee Harvey Oswald carrying a paper bag. However, at 7:30, the other Oswald was at the top 10 records. So at 7:23 a.m., Lee Harvey Oswald and Frazier leave for the TSPD with the package. At 7:50 a.m., at the TSPD, Lee Harvey Oswald enters with the package. So at 8:30, the other Oswald is at the Jiffy Market. At 9:45 a.m., Lee Harvey Oswald is seen looking out toward the motorcade route by Junior Jarman. You can see this after the video, and you can see this timeline and how well it fits together with both of the Oswalds. So we keep looking at the timeline in which we see at 12:31 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald is confronted in the lunchroom by those two witnesses, the patrolman, Marion Baker, and the superintendent of the building, in which they both vouch for Lee Harvey Oswald there. And at 12:30 p.m., you also see the other Oswald out of the Texas School Book Depository. That explains the pictures, and that explains how they could also have that testimony. So at 12:33 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald leaves the Texas School Book Depository by the front door. And 12:40, he boards a bus to make his escape. Now, at also 12:40, the other Oswald is picked up by a Rambler station wagon. This explains how there are two instances of Oswald riding on the bus and riding on the Rambler, not just one instance. At 12:44, Lee Harvey Oswald leaves the bus and when it becomes bogged down in traffic. At 12:48, Lee Harvey Oswald hails a cab and asks to be taken to the 500 North Beckley. Again, after the video, you can pause and check for the timeline yourselves. So Oswald from Tippett to the Dallas police. Now we go into the final step of the timeline. At 1 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald arrives on foot at his rooming house where he retrieves his pistol. Now the other Oswald at that same time, he was at Texas Theater and buys the ticket. At 1:03 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald leaves the rooming house. At 1:05 p.m., the other Oswald buys popcorn. So we keep going into the timeline, and you can see how everything fits together and how they were switched out at 1:40 p.m., where Lee Harvey Oswald enters the Texas Theater, and he is then arrested for the killing of JFK and Tippett, the other Oswald that is. So at 1:50 p.m., after a struggle with the police, Lee Harvey Oswald is captured. At 2 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald arrives at the Dallas Police Headquarters. So at 2:30 p.m., this is where we have Lee Harvey Oswald first question, and the other Oswald being investigated at Ruth Payne's house. So finally, we go here, in which Oswald was in custody. We have our man. At 4:05 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald is taken to the basement for the first lineup. At 4:20 p.m., he is then returned upstairs for further questioning in Fritz's office. Now, at 6:20 p.m., he is taken for the second lineup, and then you see that he is returned upstairs for questioning. Then he is formally arraigned for the murder of Tippit. Then he is taken for the third lineup, in which at 11:26 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald is charged finally with the murder of JFK. He was charged with murder, the other Oswald, at 1:40 p.m. So they have one thing wrong in this whole timeline. Oswald didn't do it in the first place, and we will prove it here now, readers. So remember that Jack Ruby and the Oswald reading from that morning? Well, this one meeting proves a conspiracy. It proves that there were two Oswalds. It proves that the police knew what was going to happen, and it proves this large cover-up simply from the fact that they had that early morning meeting at the B&B in the first place. That's the one thing that ties everything together, in which him not being the lone assassin was actually working with everyone else in this matter. Ruth Payne and Marina Oswald both testified that Lee Harvey Oswald spent the night at Ruth Payne's house and he did not leave. How could both Mary and Marina be right? Simple. That wasn't Oswald that worked at the Texas School Book Depository. It was his double. But how could it be a double? According to the official Oswald version, Lee Harvey Oswald wakes up at around 6:30 and gets ready for work. He walks over to catch a ride with work at a co-worker at around 7:23 p.m. At that time, to his house, he was carrying a large brown bag. So he arrives at the Texas School Book Depository and clocks in at around 8:15 that morning, so he would be at work that morning. Also that day, Lee Harvey Oswald was seen at this location. You can see here that on December 3rd, 1963, FBI agent Carl E. Walters wrote a memo to the FBI's SAC in Dallas, which the memo stated that on 12/3/63, Mr. John D. Whitten telephonically advised that he heard Lee Harvey Oswald was in the top 10 record shop on Jefferson on the morning of November 22nd. So now we have that information here in which he was at the record shop, the other Oswald. So at Earl Gall's, the Dallas Morning News notes that below is a scan of handwritten notes made by Texas journalist Earl Galls during an interview with the W.K. Dubstark, owner of the Top 10 record store. This is just more proof that other Oswald was at the Top 10 record store. Stark even claims that he sold Oswald a ticket to Dick Clark's show at 7:30 a.m. on November 22nd. So you can even see here on the interview and the notes that he was at the Top 10 records. So Lee Harvey Oswald bought beer at 8:30 while at work. Around 8:30 a.m., while Harvey was working at the Texas School Book Depository, Lee Oswald entered the Jiffy store at 310 S Industrial and took two bottles of beer to the counter, and Fred Moore, the store clerk, asked Oswald for identification. So FBI Special Agent David Berry interviewed Moore on December 2nd on 1963, in which Berry wrote identification of this individual arose when he asked him for identification as to proof of age for purchase of two bottles of beer. Essentially being, this is a testimony that an Oswald was at the place to buy beer, in which this is saying that this was definite proof of that. So Moore said that he noted the name appeared as Lee Oswald, possibly as H. Lee Oswald. As Moore recalled, the birth date on the license was 1939. He thought it to have been the 10th month. So wait a minute, Lee Harvey Oswald didn't have a license. He didn't even have a Texas driver's license for that matter. So Lee Harvey Oswald was at the Texas School Book Depository working at 8:30. He couldn't be at two places at once unless there were two Oswalds. So Moore's statement to the FBI, note the time of the day, note the identification, and note that this is proof of a conspiracy. Note that the FBI did not follow up on this at all. They simply chose to ignore this. You can see here, obviously, that did happen for Moore. This is more proof showing that he described that it was Oswald, a very different Oswald from the one we know. So Oswald was positively identified in 3 places to the police on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. Interesting to note, because all 3 people positively identified Oswald as being Lee Harvey Oswald to the police. All 3 people were ignored because their story did not fit the idea of a lone nut killer in the first place. That's where we have these different narratives coming up and where people are ignored simply because they don't fit the story that has already been elaborated. So Oswald was seen 3 times before noon, but where he couldn't be, no one thought this was strange and investigated it. No one thought it was strange that those 3 people were ignored and decided to try and investigate the whole matter. They just decided to brush aside all these things. Well, they were investigated by the police and FBI, since neither did anything to check out these leads. But why? What could be the only reason why 3 different people said they saw in sworn testimony to the Dallas police or FBI that they had seen Oswald that morning? How come the police and FBI decided not to investigate? Could it be as simple as the witnesses were right and police did not want to have the public to know what was going to happen, what was going on here, what was going on in the first place? Well, let's look at the record. At 2:30 a.m., you see Oswald at the Lucas B&B. At 7:30 a.m., you see him at Top 10 Records. 8:30 a.m., you see him at the Jiffy Mart, and at 10:30 a.m., you see at the Ralph Leon Yates. So we see him hitchhiking at 10:30. On that morning at the same day at 10:30 a.m., refrigeration mechanic Ralph Leon Yates was driving in the Oak Cliffs area of Dallas and stopped to pick up a hitchhiker near the Berkeley Avenue entrance to the Thornton Expressway. Oswald's rooming house was on Beckley, so this man was carrying what Yates described later as a package wrapped in round wrapping paper about 4 foot to 4 foot and a half inch and a half feet long. So Yates dropped the Oswald lookalike off at Houston and Elm, excuse me, at the stoplight by the Texas School Book Depository. When Yates got to work, he told his coworker about the strange incidents. So Yates gave his story to the FBI on November 26th and again on December 10th, in which the FBI seemed to want Yates to repudiate his story, deciding that the lie detector was inconclusive because Yates passed it so well. Now let us compare this timeline with facts. But Oswald's barber told the Warren Commission a very different story of this matter, in which Mr. Jenner from the Warren Commission, you have a distinct recollection that on occasions when this man came into your shop for a haircut, he drove up on an automobile to your shop, in which the barber said he drove that there 1955. I think it's a 1955. I'm sure it's a 1955 Chevrolet station wagon. It's either blue and white or green and white. It's two-tone. I know that. So now we go into more of his testimony in which he keeps saying it's a two-tone car. Clifton Chastain, owner of Clifton's Barbershop, located about 9 blocks from the Plain resident, testified before the Warren Commission that Oswald came in on approximately 6 occasions in the time frame before the assassination. On some occasions, he was accompanied by a young boy, age approximate 14, who spouted politics as if Oswald taught him that way. Chastain positively identified Oswald based on the photos of Oswald taken when he was distributing fair play leaflets. So Chastain had recalled that he had cut Oswald's hair 3 times, and his other barbers had done the rest. Yet Oswald was only returned from New Orleans to the Irving, Texas area on October 4th, and to get 6 haircuts between October 4th and November 8th, a period of 5 weeks, which would require a haircut every 5.8 days. So now we go into the testimony. We go into the conversation they had. So the furniture store Edith Whitworth also saw Oswald drive a two-tone car, as you can see from this testimony down here. So now we have 2 instances of which they both were in fact telling the truth of Oswald driving that two-tone car that morning. Now, who was Edith Whitworth? In early November 1963, a man noting an old sign in Miss Whitworth's store advertising a gunman's shop. He entered the store and asked about a part for a gun, in which she would tell the police that she believed the man to be Lee Oswald. He drove up in a two-tone blue and white 1957 Ford. So now we have again a testimony of it being a two-tone car that Lee Harvey Oswald drove up in. So Mrs. Whitworth could also tell the FBI that the man told her that the younger child was born on October 20th, 1963. Which was in fact the birth date of Oswald's second child. So Edith's friend also testified to the Warren Commission, of which her also seeing the two-tone car. So now we have 3 people seeing that two-tone car. How could this possibly be when he was in another place in another instance? Then the Warren Commission put Marina and the ladies for their testimony. As you can see here, they all as you can see here, they all testified under the Warren Commission. So the testimony of Mrs. Lee Harvey Oswald, Edith Whitworth, and Gertrude Hunter was taken at 11 a.m. on July 24, 1964, in the office of the U.S. Attorney 301 Post Office Building by Mr. Wesley J. Liebler, Assistant Counsel, President Commission. So note the asterisk response represents a response by Marina Oswald without assistance of the interpreter. All other responses shown for Marina Oswald were through the interpreter. So let's go ahead and go into the interview. So Mr. Liebler said, "May the record show, Marina, that you have previously been sworn as a witness when you appeared before the commission in Washington." So this is essentially Oswald's testimony. So Marina testifies that she has never been there. So, Mr. Liebler, am I correct in understanding that Marina Oswald has indicated that she will regard herself as being under continuing oath? So then we go down into the basic purpose in which he says, "For your presence here this morning relates to the testimony had been given by the two ladies, Mrs. Whitworth and Mrs. Hunter, who are outside. So that you were in a furniture store in Irving, Texas in early November with your two children and with Lee Harvey Oswald." She doesn't give a response. So now he continues to go on. "I understand that you have previously testified about this and have told the commission that you were not in the store at that time. But this is very weird. Why would she have no response?" And Mr. Lieber himself is trying to confirm his side of the story and not the other side, in which you can see those other two people and the other person saying that he was in a two-tone car. So Mrs. Oswald told the commission that he didn't drive that car in the first place. So she said, "No, never. This is all not true in the first place. My husband couldn't drive, and I was never alone with him in a car. Anytime we went in a car, it was with Ruth Payne, and we never went to any gun store and never had any telescopic lens mounted." So this is essentially going against the testimony that they saw Oswald driving in a two-tone car. So Mr. Rankin said, "Did the four of you, that is your husband, you, and your two children, ever go alone any place in Irving?" In which Mrs. Oswald said, "In Irving, the baby was only 1 month old." So they keep going down into the testimony, and finally, Mrs. Oswald said, "I was never at any time in a car with my husband with a rifle. Not only with a rifle, not even with a pistol. Even without anything, I was never with my husband in a car under circumstances where he was driving a car." So her circumstances that she definitely did not see Oswald driving. She wasn't even with Oswald when he drove. So Mr. Payne said Lee Harvey Oswald didn't drive too. Mr. Liebler says, "Did you ever see Oswald drive a car?" And Mr. Payne adamantly says, "No, I did not." So we go on further to having these two narratives, of which these two stories have contradicting facts. People who had knowledge that Lee could drive were these people right here: Chief Sastine, Joyce Bostic, Leonard Hutchinson, Inez Lake, Fred Moore. All these people knew that he could drive, and they even saw these licenses. Some of these people even saw his driver's licenses. Even these people down below, Leo Supervelda, DPD, Captain Westbrook, they saw the license. So you can see that obviously he had a license, that he was able to drive a car in the first place. But how can all of these people both be right? Marina Oswald, Robert Oswald, and Ruth and Michael Payne all told the Warren Commission in no uncertain terms that Lee Harvey Oswald did not drive an automobile and did not have a driver's license. But more than 32 witnesses said Oswald did drive, including former employees of the Texas Department of Public Safety License Records Department who saw, touched, and handled Oswald's driver's license after he was killed. How could this be? And you can see here that in the interviews of the videos, there was no driver's license. That is essentially what she says here. Multiple interviews say that they had no license, that Lee Harvey Oswald had no license. Also here, Marina Oswald to the press conference again saying that they had no license. So Ruth's testimony to the Warren Commission, in her Warren Commission testimony, she stated that as late as the weekend before the assassination of JFK, Oswald had failed to obtain a learner's permit. So this just adds smoke into the fire. This just adds more weird things going on with the whole matter. Because how could Oswald not have a license and have a license but failed the learner's permit? It's simple, real simple, as I've told you before. The only way both sides could be telling the truth was that there were two Oswalds. You have the body double and you have the actual Oswald from the timeline before. This is how everything starts to piece together from that timeline, and this is how he was set up for being the first patsy in the investigation, the fake investigation, and the conspiracy. J. Edgar Hoover said this: there is there is a possibility that an imposter is using Oswald's birth certificate. So we even have his very birth certificate being used for this conspiracy and for this elaborate ruse. So we have a very, very deep rabbit hole going on here now. These 30 people say they saw him drive a car. So we have these 30 testimonies saying that he had a car. Obviously, that was the other Oswald, because that's the only way we can account for that Oswald not having a driver's license, but having a car. Now, why were those sightings important? Well, for these three things, it shows that much of what we think is not all that there is to know. And two, there are only three possibilities. A, the Paynes and Mrs. Oswald could be lying. B, all the other witnesses could be lying. Or C, they could all be telling the truth. And three, you can eliminate by logic any other possibilities. C is the only thing that can happen in this instance because everyone was adamant in their information of what they saw. You can see here, furthermore, how adamant everyone was in those two narratives. How did Ruth Payne know to get LHO a job at the TSPD unless she was told to put him there in the first place? This whole thing starts to piece together of how the RV Oswald got that job and how there is a body double in the first place. But why two Oswalds? Why did they need Oswald? Why did they need him in the first place? Because Oswald was needed to get rid of the killer. The patsy takes out the killer, and you can get by with murder by putting him in the threshold of hatred. You put him on the public notice. But we look at the second patsy, the Warren Commission. Never a doubt that this was a patsy. The Warren Commission did not have control over this investigation, as they're the ones being controlled in the first place, being the second patsy. The cover-up was part of the plan all along. It was part of the plan to get JFK out of presidency and to get all those 15 things that they wanted. So the people in charge of the plan, and they said we were able to do the following: convince everyone involved that Oswald was working with the Russians. Unless we convicted this guy, we would find ourselves in a nuclear war. And this is where MAD comes in, mutually assured destruction, in which it was essentially what I said before. So now for this plan to work, they must have neutralized these four things. 1, the Dallas police. 2, FBI. 3, the Warren Commission. And finally, 4, Lee Harvey Oswald himself. It is clear to see that the Warren Commission is in on these things, in on these 7 things, in which they said, 1, any testimony that went against the prearranged conclusions was addressed in the Katzenbach memo, in which Oswald did it and he was alone. 2, this was meant to reinforce the narrative of him being a loner, essentially being the lone gunman narrative was the only one that they needed and the only one they wanted to have from all the witnesses. So you have him without a driver's license, you have him living apart from his wife, you have him at a minimum wage job, you have him traveling to Mexico City. If you don't worry about the truth, then you can make a truth that will suffice. So let's recap. And essentially, this is a recap of what happened on that day. So why did the Secret Service route motorcade through Elm Street? Because an L-shaped near ambush with Patsy was already waiting for JFK, and they wanted him dead. Now, how would this elaborate plan work in the first place? Let's look at how this would happen theoretically and quite literally. You wanted to kill the President of the United States, but you knew that you had to do it in such a way that you would not get caught and you could blame a person who would not talk. Now, who would you blame? You would blame someone who was easily susceptible for the public, right? So they decided to blame Lee Harvey Oswald. So let's go further in. On May 27th, a memo from CIA to J. Lee Rankin, in which Nikita Khrushchev, his wife, met with the famous newspaper columnist Drew Pearson and his wife in Cairo, Egypt, in the May of 1963. In the course of their discussions, both the leader of the USSR and his wife expressed concerns about Mrs. Kennedy and how her husband was killed. So, in fact, he expressed reservations on this one fact several times to Drew Pearson, in which he did not believe that Oswald acted alone or Ruby acted alone. You have these very coherent people say this coherent statement of he never acted alone. Oswald was never alone in this matter, but that's the narrative they wanted. So this memo was written from Richard Helms, then the deputy head of the CIA, J. Lee Malkin. So now we go further into the memos. About the USSR, the top secret memos. These were the two top secret memos that were released. USSR leaders were advised on December 4th, 1963, that JFK was murdered by a large conspiracy to effect a coup in the US government. And KGB officials on November 25th, 1963, concluded that the conspiracy had to be widespread and well organized. Two very real entities saying that Oswald was not in it alone and that this was a conspiracy. So those two people have already established this very real thing happening here in the first place. The Warren Commission ignored this press conference in the first place at Parkland Hospital concerning JFK because it didn't fit in their narrative. Of course they would ignore this press conference because it would shed light to the public, but they merely didn't want to do anything to fit in their narrative. We have this common thread of the narrative always being that Oswald was the lone gunman. So that's why they had that rushed investigation. Because would an investigation go the first people? And no. Instead, the Warren Commission was used to reach a pre-arranged conclusion. Again, we have this common thread, this common theme of Warren Commission wanting to have completely no holes in the story, and they just wanted to have that one narrative of him being the lone assassin. But if they were the ones in control, why were there so much holes in the first place? Unless they were a patsy themselves, the second patsy. So let's not begin with the conclusion and make it so. So the conclusion is what they have here on the Warren report. They didn't begin with the conclusion as what they said, but they obviously did begin with their conclusion because they already had set up everything in the first place. So let's look on to the third patsy. In order for everything to be covered up in the first place as we have now, the FBI needed to be involved. So you need a patsy. And why do you need a patsy? Because it ends the problem once and for all. It will end without a trial or a mess, and you will get by a murder. We keep constantly saying we need all these 7 patsies because we do. This is the only way the story would make sense and for all the holes in the story to have happened in the first place. You need all these patsies. So you even have leaked information immediately that he is not going to trial. How would they know that unless this was set up from the beginning and the people who set it up did know that there was not going to be a trial? How could you do this? Well, you would have to have the elements on the following board. You would have to have the mafia, the big businesses, the bankers, and big oil, essentially all these people and entities on board for this big conspiracy to happen in the first place. And that's how you know that there was no trial. That's how you know there was a conspiracy. And that's how you have all these holes of the story coming up in the first place. Some people take 1 or 2 of this group. However, the problem here is that you need help in all these 3 things in planning. So you have the logistics from the mafia, the money from the big oil and banks, and the coordination from the CIA. Now you have 2, the execution, the mafia, the CIA, the Secret Service, Dallas County Sheriff, and Dallas Police. Now Dallas County Sheriff and Dallas Police were the precautionary measures in order to make sure things all go smoothly. And finally, you have the aftermath of who's going to cover it up. The media, the mafia, the CIA, Secret Service, Dallas County Sheriff, and Dallas Police, FBI, military, all these entities and people were involved in covering up the story. Not just 1 or 2, all of them. So FBI Hoover to President LBJ, 1963, shows the FBI intent very early in the story, in which Johnson asked how many shots were fired. Hoover then replied 3, and then Johnson goes on to say, any of them fired at me. And finally, Hoover said, no, all 3 at the president, and we have them. Hoover said 2 shots were fired, splintered, but our ballistic expert was able to prove that they were fired by this gun. So you have this early on evidence of a conspiracy going on just from this very peculiar conversation. So now we go into the conversation at 2:25 p.m. in which it was an interrogation of Oswald. My name is Lee Harvey Oswald. I work at the Texas School Book Depository. I lived in Minsk in Moscow. I worked in a factory. I liked everything over there except the weather. I had a wife and some children, and my residence is at 1026. And Oswald recognized FBI Jim Hosty and said, you have been at my home 2 or 3 times talking to my wife. I don't appreciate your coming out there when I was not there. I was never in Mexico City. I have been in Tijuana. The only way this could be true is having 2 Oswalds. So how does this brief correspondence take out the Warren Commission report? Well, again, I've said Well, again, I've said there was only two Oswald, but let's go into these six things. It shows that the FBI knew about Oswald. It shows, it reinforces the comments made by the police chief Jesse Curry said on 11/22nd, and it takes out the retraction given by the police chief Jesse Curry said the next day, and James Hosty knew where Oswald's wife lived. Essentially, all these things take out the Warren Commission because of their invalidity to the Warren Commission itself. And finally, six, nothing about the rest of the investigation is exactly as it was portrayed in the Warren report. Because if you start looking into the facts, into the very small details, you can see that things don't fit in. And again, I've said it again, the time and time again, that the only way this is possible to happen, the only way for the holes to be appropriate in the story is for these seven patsies and for the Warren Commission to be a patsy themselves. The FBI did, and then they did not, which is Jesse Curry's photo and statement here, Your Honors. So let's go into the questioning of Hosty. So Mr. Stern asked what happened in your effort to locate him, and Mr. Hosty said, I then received a communication on the 25th of October from the New Orleans office advising me that another agency had determined that Lee Harvey Oswald was in contact with the Soviet embassy in Mexico City in the early part of October 1963. So Mr. Stern said, did they tell you anything else? And Mr. Hosty said, no, just very briefly that there had been a contact. So we go further into the questioning in which, did this increase your effort to find him? And Mr. Hosty said, very much so. Yes, I became curious. Then shortly thereafter, on the 29th of October, in which I received another communication from New Orleans office advising that they had changed the address for Lee Harvey Oswald, Marina Oswald, to 2515 West Street. Now, why would they need to change that address? And now we go further into the questioning, in which Mr. Hosty said, well, I checked the Dallas crisscross, and unfortunately, Irving is a superb suburb outside of Dallas, and people residing in Irving not covered in the city directory. So essentially what we have here is a questioning of his very narrative to fit into the Warren Commission in the first place. They wanted him to say these things in order to fit into the narrative of him being the lone gunman, but he says very peculiar things that anyone could take with a grain of salt, but we need to take notice to. But now we look into whose name at that time I didn't know, but who I know now to be Miss Dorothy Roberts, as you can see from the changing of the addresses. Now we go further into the testimony, and what did Mrs. Roberts tell you? And Mr. Hosty said, Mrs. Roberts told me that the residence of 2515 West 5th Street was Mrs. Ruth Payne's house, the wife of Michael R. Payne. They were at this time separated, and Michael was not living at that address. She told me that Michael Payne was employed at the Engineer Bell Helicopter Company in Fort Worth, Texas. So we have someone else's house being changed address. She further told me that there was a Russian-born and Russian-speaking woman residing with Mrs. Payne, and she told me this woman did not speak any English and that she had just given birth the week before to a new baby. This is how this all fits into the narrative of how they would have the baby and how they would be at the house at that time. So we go again further into the testimony. What did you do next? On the 31st of October, I did a credit check on Michael and Ruth Payne for the purpose of developing further background. This credit check showed that Michael Payne was employed at Bell Helicopter as an engineer, essentially just doing the details of the whole thing. So he goes on to say that I then checked the criminal records of the Irving Police Department, Dallas County Sheriff's Office, in which they said they had no record for either Ruth or Michael Payne. He contacted the Bell Helicopter Co. and the security officer at Bell Helicopter, Mr. Ted Sherman, advised me that Michael Payne was employed by them as a research engineer and he held a security clearance. So now you have these things going on in the whole testimony and in the whole narrative. So what was the purpose of all these inquiries into the background of Mr. and Mrs. Payne? In which Mr. Hosty said, I wanted to make sure before I approached Mrs. Payne that she was not involved in any way with Lee Harvey Oswald and any type of activities which were against the best interest of the United States. Now, it is interesting to know what Hosty knew and how he knew that. He knew these six things. So he knew that Ruth and Michael were separated. He knew that Lee and Marina were separated. He knew exactly where Marina lived, and he knew exactly where to search for Oswald's stuff because it was obvious to everyone at the time when you separate from your wife, you keep all of your possessions with her at the place she is boarding at. So this would, like such important things, This would be like such important things as a spy camera, a rifle, and pictures. Hosty knew that Oswald would get mad if he continued to press his wife for information. Does this sound like a person who was separated from their wife? Not at all. It sounds like a worried husband who doesn't like other men spending time around and suspiciously with their wife. And finally, 6, Oswald spent his last night of freedom on this earth with his wife. This is how you know that they weren't supposed to be separated, but that he knew that they were separated for very weird reasons. So the Hosty testimony to the Warren Commission, we go further into this in which it supports that we just established, in which did she seem surprised at your visit? That no, she didn't. She was quite friendly and invited me in. You looked it up while you were there and said, yes, it was my recollection that it was there on 411 Elm Street. This just supports further the narrative that happened on that day, Your Honors, in which Mr. Stern keeps asking these questions. She tell you why she thought she was living here alone at Dallas at that time? Well, she said she did not want him at her house. She was willing to take Marina Oswald and the 2 children, but she didn't have room for him. So essentially being, they were only separated because they didn't have room. So now we go to the end of this interview. Were you alone with Mrs. Payne throughout this period? And Mr. Hosty finally says no. Towards the conclusion of the interview, Marina Oswald, who had apparently been napping, entered the living room. So we go further into the mock trial evidence of this being the video of the whole thing. So there were too many coincidences in this story. There were too many things going on of how he knew things and how he pieced together. And the FBI had to have been involved in the cover in order for this to have happened in the first place, in order for him to have all this information on the case, because he couldn't have had these coincidental things. Now, let's look at the destruction of Oswald. In 1975, the allegation surfaced that the FBI had destroyed a note delivered to it by Lee Harvey Oswald just 1 or 2 weeks prior to the assassination of President Kennedy. And its FBI investigation failed to find any records relating to this, but interviews of Dallas field office personnel established that an Oswald visit and note drop-off had occurred. So the results of this were essentially Oswald definitely did visit the Dallas field office a week or 2 weeks prior to the assassination. When he told that Hosty was not in, Oswald left a note in an envelope which was unsealed. The note contains some sort of threat, but accounts varied widely as to whether Oswald threatened to blow up the FBI or merely report this to the higher authorities. And finally, within hours after Oswald's murder on November 24th, 1963, Hosty destroyed the note and memorandum, which special agent in charge, Gordon Shanklin, had ordered written, excuse me, again, on November 22nd. So we have these very peculiar things going on. Why would they need to cover up that note in the first place? Because the FBI covered up evidence at the time. An FBI agent who reported that it failed to show that the building from which the shots were fired. Agent Milton L. Newsom reported that the film did depict the president's car at the precise time shots were fired. However, the pictures were not sufficiently clear for identification purposes. This essentially means that from the very beginning, you have a cover-up. You can see these 2 very different films of there being an obvious cover-up, and you can watch these films later. So the FBI witnesses ignored these 2 witnesses because it did not fit into the narrative of what they were trying to cover up. They were working in cahoots with the Warren Commission, with the CIA, in order to make this whole thing go swell in the first place. The FBI claimed the Bronson film didn't show anything of value. But if it didn't show anything of value, why do you have these 2 very peculiar pictures, very interesting pictures going on here? Obviously, someone was at the window at the time. Why were FBI James Hosty and James Bookout in if the FBI wasn't? Why were they in there in the first place? How does this thing fit together? And now, finally, we're done with that. We're done with the 3rd patsy. And as we go into the 4th patsy, you can obviously see that there were 2 Jack Rubies. Why were there 2 Jack Rubies? This was a Jack Ruby because Ruby did not have any sunglasses. So now let's go into establishing the both of the Jack Rubies. So Bookout as Ruby does Bookout kill Oswald. As you can see here, they are 2 very different people, 2 very different ears, 2 very different necks, 2 very different haircuts. And notice the difference around the neck and the sideburns. These photos don't match up with each other. So that means that there can only be the only 2 Jack Rubies, a double of another. Notice the size of the ears, and as I've mentioned, these don't fit at all. And the tapered sides. And again, notice the clean neck of the shooter. These don't match at all. It just means that there were more evidence that there was 2 Rubies. And clearly it wasn't Ruby who killed Oswald, but another person who impersonated him. That wasn't Ruby in the basement. It was the other Ruby, Jack Ruby at the police station November 6th. November 22nd. As you can see here, two very different people. Now, Jack Ruby at the Oswald killing, we have to look into if what it was staged or not. And he says, I am as innocent regarding any conspiracy as any of you gentlemen in the room. Obviously, he was set up. Jack Ruby had a double, 2 murders in 2 days in public, as you can see here. And where were the police? They were simply watching the whole thing conspire and unravel because they wanted to help cover up and they wanted to make sure things go smoothly, of which it did go smoothly. Now we go into the fifth patsy, the Dallas police. So the Dallas police produce evidence that would be used in the investigation, right? So if we look at it that way, that means they must be the fifth patsy because they're the ones who had to produce everything in order to fit in this narrative. We go further into the Dallas police and they have all these pictures, they have all these things going on in the investigation. Why did they hurriedly arrest Oswald in the first place? And look at these key people. As you can see, they had all these wallets, they had all these informations. They're the ones who procured the evidence in the first place. But did they really find the evidence, or were they simply planting it? So Captain Westbrook at the scene personnel department, in which you can see here the JFK assassination wallet mystery, in which they asked him about the wallet. And they asked him about the two names, and they asked the only man alive today would see it. So we even look at the shell casings of what the police produced, in which 1 and 3 appear to be a match, but 2 and 4 are standalone. You can see the very obvious differences in these things, of which how they were standalone pistols, and they obviously were set up and planted there in the first place. The police should have had no connection with Oswald, and they had very little hard evidence. Yet an arrest warrant was issued at 1:40 for Lee Harvey Oswald. How could they issue an arrest warrant without any proof, without anything at all? And this was issued even before they knew results of the ballistic test or the direct evidence of anything at all. So this is the only reason why this could happen, is that they were a patsy in on the whole thing. Now we're starting to see the common theme of their being patsies, of them being the ones who planted the very errored investigations in the first place. And this just proves, these testimonies just proves that they were further investigating this false investigation. Now let's look at Westbrook and Hill right with the press. Let's see how this goes into the whole matter. Police Captain W.R. Westbrook and Sergeant Stringer had headed for a car and asked if I wanted to come along. I piled in and rode with them across Houston Street Viaduct, and I kept wondering if my decision to leave the book depository had been a mistake, but I wanted to know what cop had been shot. The police radio talked of a suspect running from the south of 400 block of East 10th Street, and spots were converging on this area. So if we go further down, you can see that Hill said Tippett was probably DOA. It was in my mind, and then I think it was in the minds of most cops, that Tippett shooting had some connection with the assassination. So the official story, was there a fight or was there not? As you can see here, the official story is that after Officer McDonald disarmed Oswald, Detective Bob Carroll took Oswald's gun and stuck it into his belt before leaving the theater. Now we can look into how exactly if there was a fight. We can look at when Hill said to Eddie Berker in 1967 interview. So when Hill was interviewed by Eddie Berker of the CBS television, he explained to Barker the events which allegedly transpired inside the theater with regards to Oswald's arrest. And Hill told Berker that as soon as we got handcuffs on Oswald and got him up, Bob Carroll was going to be the first man that maneuvered with him. And I had both hands on Oswald inside the theater. So there was a fight from his point of view and from his perspective. And he said that this was the prisoner's gun and I stuck it in my belt under my coat. So obviously this fits in with the narrative of Oswald being the lone assassin. So Sergeant Hill had opportunity in the dark to place a gunman. How did to place a gun? How did a pistol that about 35 minutes before just shoot and killed a police officer be defective now? How was that gun defective when it was just used? Did Sergeant Hill place a pistol, and was this just seeding, or was it all part of a clever plot? So we go further. This was the pistol that Detective Hill used to arrest Lee Harvey Oswald. The narrative changes when this is the gun used by the police department officer, Sergeant Hill. So now we have a change of narrative in order to fit everything in. So we have this interview, which just further supports the theory, not the theory, but the narrative that they wanted to set up. Obviously being obviously being the Warren Commission's narrative. So on November, because they were a patsy. So now we go into November 22nd, in which there were almost 2,000 officers, yet the only ones who were discovering things were the ones who were not supposed to find anything in the first place. They weren't supposed to be connected, but they were connected. They were promptly told that they weren't supposed to be about the case. But look here, Captain Westbrook was with the personnel office, and Sergeant Gerald Hill was with the personnel office. And you see these four people finding everything and finding the evidence. Again, I've told you, did they find the evidence, or were they simply planting it in places that were convenient? Because it was too coincidental that they found everything very very quickly and very easily. So two Oswalds meet Officer Tippit, in which at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, November 20, 1963, Dallas Police Officer J.D. Tippit was having coffee at the Dobbs House restaurant. Another man known to employees as a regular coffee customer was complaining loudly about his order of eggs to waitress Mary Dowling. Tippit, a frequent customer, noticed that the incident but said nothing. Both the owner and employees of the Dobbs House later identified the man as Lee Harvey Oswald, who was complaining. So, on again the same day, Tippit's last words to his son. Now, you're gonna like this one. How would he know that? How would he express these feelings unless he knew he was going to be killed that day? So let's go into it. On that morning, J.D. Tippit hugged his eldest son, Alan, and said, "No matter what happens today, I want you to know that I love you." Such overt signs of affection toward his son were uncharacteristic of Tippit. This was the last time young Alan Tippit saw his father alive. How would he express this much love and care? Obviously, this was against his normal characteristics, but he said this on that day. When you start piecing together the puzzle pieces, you know why he said that, and because something obviously was going to happen to that day. He was either knowing he was going to get killed or that he could never see his son ever again. Now, why did the Warren Commission never asked about this? Why were they never asked about this whole incident? Because neither the employees nor owners of Dobbs House Restaurant, Top 10 Record Store, or the Jiffy Store were called to testify because it didn't go with the narrative. He could not have been a Dobbs House Top 10 Record or the Jiffy Store on Industrial Boulevard because it didn't fit that Oswald. Again, we go back into how they start covering things up, and now Captain Westbrook and Sergeant Hill are assigned in Personnel Department and Internal Affairs on that day. All they got from Personnel Office to the scene of the Texas Code Book Depository is right here, right here, readers, because you can read right here and pause the video, but we'll be going ahead of that. Apparently, however, Captain Westbrook said the following. He testified before the Warren Commission that I can't recall whether or not it was the dispatcher's office, but I think it was. Somebody in the dispatcher's office told us that they had needed more men at the Texas Code Book Depository building, so I sent the men that were in my office. Very weird things going on with what happened and what he actually said. So the plan was to tie Oswald to the killing of JFK. The problem would be, this is how the police would have eventually done it. The problem would be it would take a long time to get evidence for an arrest for this such crime. How about if you could speed it up somewhat? Well, enter evidence that points to a person left at the scene of crime. Wouldn't this create a timescale that would be needed? And the rifle to TSBD, bullet casing to TSBD, and the billfold at Tippit's scene and the jacket left outside TSBD. This would create a link between JFK and Tippit, creating a quick arrest and how they could possibly arrest him with this little evidence in the first place. That's because they were seeding evidence. Bellin and the Warren Commission knew that Hill was on the 6th floor of the Texas Code Book Depository before Mooney got there. Excuse me again. If Hill was there, why? Could he have planted the casings? As you can see, obviously, the Sergeant Hill was on the 6th floor. So we have very strange facts about the first search on November 22nd, 1963, in which Captain Fritz tells officers to go search Ruth Payne's house, asked to search by name, not address. Why would they want to search by name and not address in the first place? The Dallas PD do not have jurisdiction in Irving, and Irving PD or Dallas County Sheriff would have jurisdiction. Why would you search a house that you already knew about in the city that wasn't yours unless you were part of it as well in the first place? So Michael Payne's statement on the photos, in which he said in his testimony, only acknowledges seeing a backyard photo at the DPD headquarters on the night of the assassination. So the photos will not be officially discovered until the morning afternoon. Now here is where the problem begins, readers. The police arrest Oswald at 1:40 p.m. for killing President Kennedy, but do not have any evidence at all linking him to the crime. So there's no problem. The police go to Ruth Paine's house to get the information. They need to tie the two together, essentially doing an illegal search because that wasn't the law of the land in the first place, and that they arrested having no evidence in the first place. So you have the order very wrong here, readers, because they're supposed to have evidence before they convict anyone of arrest. So let's go further. If you see an investigation, you can see that the owner of the house says, "Come in, we've been expecting you." What could that possibly mean unless they were part of the investigation and they called ahead to make sure? So let's go further. This is clearly an admission of a conspiracy, and they can't give or grant rights to search other people's materials because they can't volunteer give away other people's materials, and this was done before he was interrogated. Oh, sorry about that. And if you can see the Rosa statement on November 22nd, search of Paine's home, you can see that we asked her if we could march the house, and she accepted that they could search. Now, if we go further, you can see Mrs. Marina Oswald on this search. She couldn't speak English. So we've heard before that she was a Russian-speaking patient in living that house that day, but how would she make a perfectly grammatical and English affidavit in the first place? She couldn't speak, and mind you, the handwriting, she also written in perfect cursive. She didn't speak English, but she could apparently do all these things by herself. Again, very peculiar and interesting facts going on with the case. Not the police report, in which here police detectives get permission from Miss Ruth Paine's house. Again, we have this very weird issue going on in which this was the law of the land at that day. In Chapman v. United States, the court ruled that the landlord's consent is insufficient to search the house. So she couldn't even done that in the first place. But why? Because she was in on it as well with them. She was expecting the people to come over, and now we look further into the law of the land. State police officers acting without a warrant or with the consent of a petitioner's landlord, when this very real does go against this Chapman v. United States. So again, all evidence was illegally obtained. So what does this mean 54 years later? It means the plan was never to take anyone to trial. The plan was to have doubles for Jack Ruby and Oswald himself to allow for needed the plot developments. So we have these 5 things going on. A, have Oswald ID on the 6th floor and in the doorway. B, have Oswald escape via the bus and station wagon. C, have an Oswald in the theater and one near the murder of Tippit. D, the plan to eliminate several key low-level players, Tippit, Oswald, Ruby. And finally, E, that evidence was circumstantial and would not have stood up in court. So that means they ignored court because this was obviously illegal information. So the Warren Commission ends as it began. It ended once it started having this investigation, and they fully fit the narrative by not going to trial, by not establishing that this was illegal evidence, and finally by ignoring everything by the books and simply arresting and getting information ahead of time. So what did we learn essentially from here? We learned these 7 things, readers. We learned that 1, Oswald was proven guilty because of selection of the evidence, not preponderance of the evidence, let alone beyond a reasonable doubt. And we learned that Oswald didn't kill JFK, and that 3, we learned that Ruby didn't kill Oswald. We learned the elements of the government, along with several might partners perform an overthrow of our government or a soft coup. We learned that the murders took place in public, yet American appears to not care anymore. We learned that the American media is taking their marching orders from the government. And finally, we learned that although many organizations were involved, only small groups, and each one knew exactly what was going on here. They were the only ones who were in on it, and they were the only ones who were being controlled, as long as the rest of the populace fits into the narrative. Now, where is the motive here? On November 26, 1963, President Johnson signed a National Security Act memorandum, in which the highest level's national security document as guidance for future Vietnam plans and policy. This brief directive most significantly initiated changes reversing Kennedy's Vietnam of NSAM, October 11, 1963. Strangely, the NSAM, which began the change in Kennedy's policy toward Vietnam, was drafted on November 21, 1963, the day before Kennedy died. So we have these things going on here. If we piece the things together, together, it wasn't Kennedy's policy after all. He would not have requested it, and he would not have signed it. Why would it have been drafted for his signature on the day before he died, and why would it have been given to Johnson so quickly? Because Johnson had not asked for it. On November 21, 1963, Johnson had no expectation whatsoever of being president on November 26. So finally, we look at the sixth patsy. LBJ wanted to become president, right? He was about to be dumped from the ticket the Kennedy brothers never wanted him on in the first place. He went from the most powerful person in D.C. as the Senate Majority Leader to the least most powerful position. All of this is true. It is also true that LBJ was not a healthy man. He knew he couldn't wait to run for president in '76, and he was right. Either death or crimes would knock him out by then, but his chance was 63. Now, with all the information, you could have easily concluded that he was the architect of the plot, not a patsy, but please look at this evidence. He never knew he was going to be president, and the thing was signed before he was president in the first place. So how could he have been president and signed it off him unless he was being controlled too? That's the only way this is going to be possible. Look at the evidence we have, readers. Comparing the executive orders on Vietnam, the 263, in which this was proof of a soft coup, on the 273, in which this is mysterious timing, because signed on November 26, 1963, this was the first national security by President Lyndon B. Johnson. So we have weird things going on here in which he didn't even expect to happen in the first place. He just signed it. So we have marked top secret drafted November 21, 1963, signed by President LBJ on November 26, 1963. Why would JFK order this done when he was in Texas and all of his staff was in meeting in Hawaii? This is proof of the soft coup right here. They signed it for him, and they knew this was going to happen, so they controlled LBJ in the House and put him in his place. Why would they make this draft unless they knew JFK was going to be there? So they finally completed the soft coup, as you can see from the obvious wink here. So we further look into how this all ties in together, as you can see here. Why was Police Chief Jesse Curry at a plane and he's flying to Washington, D.C. when JFK's killers are on the loose? Or he has a criminal prosecution or investigation to conduct, unless, of course, he already has a patsy ready already in hand, as you can see here. And everything just flies in together if you do it in the narrative of everyone becoming a patsy. LBJ was a patsy, the FBI was a patsy, a Warren Commission was a patsy, Jack Ruby and Oswald was a patsy themselves. So to become president, he was a patsy, and LBJ had to sell out for the warrant. This meant that LBJ had to agree with the powers that we would send troops to Vietnam, making the idea that we were all this powerful leader of the free world. Why would he have to promise them anything to the office? So instead of being the leader of the free world or the leader of a soft coup, LBJ, by this evidence, just becomes another patsy. He was used and manipulated. Worst of all, on March 31, 1968, he had to give it all up as a broken man. So finally, we look at the final patsy here. We look at the mafia. Many JFK researchers try to blame the mafia or the killing of the president, and they might be right in some respects. But there is one major fact they have overlooked. The mafia was much more powerful before 1963 than even today. The mafia ran a very high amount of drugs and all illegal activities in the U.S. during the height of power in the 50s and the 60s. Today, their power has decreased, and many of the leaders of the mafia met their own death of this in this ordeal. You can see that they silenced people who would take away from the narrative. And they even said, we took care of Kennedy. This is very obvious evidence that they were just being controlled because they needed to have everything fit in together. And that's how we have all the 7 patsies. That's how we have all these evidence being loosely fitted so that they could be the ones targeted for suspicion and not the ones who are really under control. As we can look here, we can look here, the members of the mafia right here. So we go further, in which these facts lead to only one question. If the FBI had a protective watch on a witness and there were no signs of a break-in or struggle in the house, was Sam Giancana killed by the mafia or by the people who plotted the murder in the first place? Either way, leading mafia plotter of 1963, Sam Giancana, dies of a tragic death, a death much more similar to that of a patsy more than a plotter. So does this remind you of anyone? The 7 patsy, That's right. It reminds you of the seven dwarfs. It reminds you of them being controlled. Again, we've said this early on. These were the seven patsies of the investigation. All of these people and organizations were being controlled from the very beginning. Oswald, the Warren Commission, FBI, Dallas PD, Ruby, LBJ, and finally the Mafia. Their deaths were very suspicious, and how they pieced together everything was also very suspicious, unless you look at it from the point of view of them being patsies. These obvious mistakes would make them the very ones being suspicious of for these things happening, for the investigations in the first place. Now that I have established this theory to you, it's your turn to decide whether you accept this, whether you accept this as fact, or whether you accept this narrative into today's reading. We also learn that we need to be vigilant in these things. We, as leaders of the next generation, should be vigilant and continue our research in this area. If we do not, the people will forget, and our country will be lost in the forever spiraling way of being a patsy and being in control of everything around us. Now, that is all I will be presenting to you, readers, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation on this new narrative on this investigation. In the meeting? All right. Should I just stop the video? All right, hold on. Right here. Meeting for all.